She said I was lucky she liked smart mouths, and I couldn't tell if she was joking. The first time I saw her, I almost didn't notice her at first. The classroom was warm with sunlight spilling through tall windows, dust motes floating lazily in the golden light. I slid into my seat near the back, trying to act casual while my backpack scraped against the metal frame of the chair. That's when I saw her. She moved with an effortless grace, the kind that made even a mundane action, adjusting the stack of papers on her desk, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear, seemed deliberate and magnetic. She was in her early 40s, confident without being imposing, and there was a quiet softness in her eyes that made it impossible not to notice her. She wore a deep navy blouse that complemented the warmth of her skin and a subtle necklace that caught the sunlight whenever she moved. Her gaze swept over the class, sharp and observant, yet when it landed on me, I felt a flicker of something I couldn't quite name, an almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of her lips. My heart did something strange, a small, unfamiliar flutter. I tried to focus on the syllabus she was explaining, the rhythm of her voice steady, clear, but the words felt secondary to the way she leaned slightly on her desk, fingers brushing the papers as if every movement mattered. Then, almost casually, she glanced at me again and raised an eyebrow. It was subtle, but it carried weight, the kind of look that suggested she'd noticed something about me, something I hadn't realized I was broadcasting. My smart mouth, my tendency to answer questions with more curiosity than caution, had probably given me away. I shifted in my seat, aware that she could see every twitch of nervous energy, yet somehow that only made me more alert, more alive. I caught the scent of her perfume, light, floral, and faintly warm, and it wrapped around me like a whisper, soft and disorienting. My fingers brushed against my notebook, and I realized my hand was trembling slightly. It wasn't fear exactly, more, anticipation. That first moment, fleeting as it was, felt charged, like standing too close to something beautiful that you aren't sure you're allowed to touch. She called on me once, and I stumbled over my words, not in embarrassment, but in an awkward sort of awareness, the way your chest feels when someone's presence makes everything else fade into the background. She didn't correct me sharply, instead, her lips curved into a small, amused smile. "Careful," she said lightly, "you're lucky I like smart mouths." That offhand comment, casual to anyone else, hit me like a spark. Lucky? Liked? I wasn't sure if she was teasing, warning, or acknowledging the quiet pull between us, but I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind. The rest of the class blurred into a haze of lectures and scribbled notes, but I couldn't stop noticing her, the slight crease at the corner of her eyes when she smiled, the way she leaned just slightly toward the students she addressed, and the gentle authority that made even a simple classroom feel alive. By the time the bell rang, I realized I was already waiting, quietly, for the next moment she might look my way again. That brief encounter, filled with sunlight, subtle touches, and unspoken acknowledgement, had planted something I knew would grow slowly, inevitably, in ways I wasn't yet ready to understand. The following week, the classroom felt different somehow. Maybe it was because I was already attuned to her presence, or maybe it was because she had noticed me, truly noticed me, in that brief exchange the first day. The sunlight still poured in through the tall windows, warm and soft, dust motes drifting lazily in the light. But now, there was a subtle electricity in the air whenever our eyes met across the rows of desks. It started with a question she posed about a complex topic, something that would have flustered most students. I answered quickly, a little too eagerly, and caught her eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing my words. Then she tilted her head, a small smirk tugging at her lips, and countered with a point that made me pause, forcing me to think on my feet. The exchange was playful yet charged, a verbal dance that neither of us wanted to end. "Careful," she said softly, leaning lightly on her desk, "I've been known to challenge even the smartest of mouths." Her tone wasn't harsh, it was teasing, deliberate, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I felt a mix of thrill and nerves. Every time she leaned forward to emphasize a point, her hand brushed near mine on the desk, close enough that the warmth of her skin seemed to linger in the space between us. I couldn't tell if it was intentional or accidental, but it made my pulse quicken in ways I hadn't expected. When I replied with a witty comeback, she laughed, soft, genuine, and low enough that it seemed meant only for me. Her laughter had a resonance that filled the room and left a warmth behind, like sunlight pooling on your skin. I caught myself stealing glances at her, noticing the subtle ways she moved, the graceful arc of her hand, the slight tilt of her neck, the gentle curve of her shoulders under the blouse. Every detail seemed heightened, charged with meaning I couldn't quite name. The other students were present, but they faded into the background. The conversation had shifted from purely academic to something more personal, though neither of us spoke of it outright. There was a rhythm developing between us, a silent agreement to push boundaries just enough to feel alive without crossing into anything overt. At one point, as I reached for my notebook, my hand brushed hers. It was a fleeting contact, barely there, yet it left a spark, a momentary acknowledgement that neither of us wanted to ignore. Her eyes met mine, holding mine longer than necessary, and I felt a strange warmth that was equal parts admiration, amusement, and something more. By the end of the class, I was flushed, not from embarrassment, but from the intensity of the interaction. She smiled as I packed my things, a small, knowing curve of her lips that made it impossible not to notice the subtle tension in the room. The kind of tension that promised more conversations, more teasing, more of these moments that were slowly unraveling the ordinary routine of the classroom. As I walked out, I found myself replaying the exchanges, her words lingering in my mind, and the soft brush of her hand on mine lingering on my skin. Something was quietly, irrevocably shifting between us, and I knew that from this playful banter, something deeper was beginning to take shape, an attraction built not on haste or physicality, but on connection, wit, and a growing awareness of each other's presence. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I ran into her outside the classroom, in the small campus cafe tucked between the library and the lecture halls. The smell of coffee, warm bread, and the faint hint of cinnamon filled the air, but somehow it didn't matter. All I noticed was her presence instantly drawing my attention like a magnet I didn't know I had. She was sitting at a corner table, laptop open, fingers tapping lightly on the keyboard. The sunlight caught in her dark hair, giving it a soft halo that made her seem almost ethereal. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should interrupt, but before I could think too long, she looked up and smiled, a small, knowing smile that made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't quite explain. "Fancy seeing you here," she said, her voice warm and inviting, though edged with amusement. I shrugged, trying to sound casual. I guess I needed a break from all the equations and debates. She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that makes a space feel intimate even in public. "I get it. I often need a break too," she said, gesturing to the laptop. "Do you want to sit?" I nodded, sliding into the chair across from her. The air between us was already charged with familiarity, the kind that only forms when two people have spent hours navigating subtle interactions, reading each other's unspoken cues. We started talking about class, of course, but quickly veered into more personal territory. Books, favorite cafes, the little annoyances of campus life. She listened with an intensity that made me feel seen, not judged. Every so often, her fingers would brush over her notebook as she spoke, sometimes dangerously close to mine on the table. Each time, I felt a spark, a subtle warmth that lingered even after our hands separated. Her eyes held mine longer than necessary at times, as if she were weighing something she didn't say aloud. And I noticed the tiny gestures, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the tilt of her head when she laughed at a joke, the slight crease of her brow when she was thinking. It was all so deliberate, yet casual, a perfect storm of awareness and ease. At one point, as we reached for the same pastry, our hands brushed. It was fleeting, but it made my pulse jump and sent a shiver up my spine. She didn't pull away immediately, instead, her hand lingered a fraction of a second longer than it should have, and I caught a small, amused glint in her eyes. It was playful, intimate, and yet completely appropriate, a brush of connection that spoke volumes without words. For a while, we simply sat in companionable silence, sipping coffee, our shoulders occasionally brushing. The cafe noise faded into a soft background hum as we shared the small moments, exchanging glances, smiles, and subtle touches. Each second felt layered with meaning, a quiet acknowledgement that something was building, slowly but unmistakably, between us. When it was time to leave, she closed her laptop and gave me a small, lingering smile. "See you in class?" she asked. There was a gentle warmth in her tone, an unspoken promise that this moment wasn't just a coincidence. I nodded, already replaying our conversation in my head. That afternoon, amidst the aroma of coffee and the soft chatter of the cafe, something shifted between us. The classroom had been the spark, but here, in the quiet intimacy of shared moments, that spark became a slow, steady flame. I walked away with a strange, fluttering anticipation, knowing that this connection, subtle and unspoken, was just beginning. It started with a glance, one of those fleeting moments that lasts just long enough to make your chest tighten without anyone else noticing. The classroom was buzzing with quiet activity, papers rustling, pens scratching, sunlight streaming through the tall windows. But somehow, all of that faded when I caught her eyes across the room. There was a softness in her gaze this time, a subtle curiosity mingled with amusement, and it felt like she was seeing me in a way that no one else ever had. She leaned slightly toward the student next to her when she spoke, but I noticed the brief flicker of her eyes back to me. It was effortless, almost accidental, but I couldn't ignore it. My pulse quickened, a fluttering awareness settling in my stomach that this connection was deepening, silently and steadily. During a discussion, she complimented an answer I gave, her voice low and warm, carrying a sincerity that made my heart skip. "That's a thoughtful perspective," she said, her fingers brushing over my notebook as she leaned in to look at my notes. The touch was slight, casual, almost imperceptible, but it sent an electric warmth up my arm. Her attention felt focused entirely on me, and yet entirely natural, as though this closeness had always been meant to exist. I found myself acutely aware of her movements. The way she rested her hand on her chin, the slight tilt of her head when she laughed quietly at something I said, the gentle shift of her shoulders as she leaned to address the class, all of it seemed heightened, meaningful. Every motion held a subtle invitation, a hint of vulnerability tucked beneath her confidence. During a quiet moment, she reached over to adjust a book on the table near me. Our hands brushed, a contact so fleeting it could have been dismissed as chance, but her eyes met mine just long enough to make it anything but accidental. There was a silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding that passed between us in the space of a heartbeat. The warmth of that brief touch lingered, like a soft ember smoldering beneath the surface. Even the pauses between our interactions carried weight. A glance held a second too long, a smile that curved only at the corners of her lips, a subtle inhale as she prepared to respond, all of it contributed to a tension that was unspoken but undeniable. I caught myself replaying every detail in my mind, the gentle arch of her brow, the hint of color in her cheeks, the quiet steadiness in her voice that contrasted with the flutter in my chest. By the end of class, the air between us was thick with something unspoken. I didn't need words to know that she was aware of the same connection I felt, a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and a quiet, undeniable pull. As we packed our things, our shoulders brushed once more, just enough to send a jolt of warmth through me. She gave a small, knowing smile, and I felt a rare, fragile excitement settle in my chest. It wasn't bold or dramatic, but it was enough. The subtle glances, the fleeting touches, the unspoken acknowledgement, they were all pieces of a puzzle slowly coming together. Something was unfolding, quietly, deliberately, and I sensed that this slow-burning connection was no longer just a possibility, it was becoming a reality. And somewhere beneath the warmth and nervous excitement, I knew that neither of us would be able to ignore it for long. It was during one of those quiet afternoons when the campus felt almost empty, the hum of distant footsteps and the soft rustle of leaves the only soundtrack. She had asked me to come by her office to discuss a project, but it quickly became clear that this wasn't just about classwork. The room was warm, filled with the soft scent of coffee and old books, and sunlight streamed in through the blinds, casting gentle stripes across the floor. She leaned back in her chair, arms resting lightly on the desk, her posture relaxed but poised. There was a softness in her expression that I hadn't noticed before, a quiet vulnerability behind her confident demeanor. For the first time, it felt like she wasn't the teacher, and I wasn't the student, we were simply two people talking, unguarded, in a space that felt safe. "I'll be honest," she began, her voice quieter than usual, almost hesitant, "sometimes I forget how isolating this job can be. You know, managing expectations, keeping everything professional." She paused, glancing at me with a small, almost shy smile. "It's nice to have someone to talk to who challenges me in a way that's genuine." Her words caught me off guard. I had always admired her confidence, her control in the classroom, but here, in this softer light, I could see the weight she carried, the quiet pressures no one else noticed. I felt a swell of empathy, a desire to bridge that gap between admiration and understanding. "I get it," I said, leaning forward slightly, careful to respect her space but wanting her to know I was fully present. "Sometimes I feel the same way, like I have to prove myself constantly, and the smallest misstep feels bigger than it really is." My words came out more honestly than I had planned, but the honesty felt natural, necessary. She looked at me then, really looked, and there was something unspoken in her gaze, a recognition of shared vulnerability. For a moment, we simply sat there, the quiet hum of the office surrounding us, and I felt an intimacy that had nothing to do with touch, nothing to do with words, yet everything to do with presence. Her hand rested lightly near mine on the desk, not moving closer, but not retreating either. It was a simple, understated gesture, yet it carried a warmth that seemed to seep into my skin. The sunlight caught the edge of her hair, a soft halo, and I noticed the subtle curve of her lips, the slight crease at the corner of her eyes that hinted at her inner thoughts. I realized then that this was the moment where the tension between us deepened, not through flirtation or teasing, but through honesty and vulnerability. She had let me into a space few people saw, and I had reciprocated. The connection wasn't loud or dramatic, it was quiet, steady, and profoundly intimate. As I left her office, the air felt different, lighter, yet heavier in all the ways that mattered. I carried with me the memory of her soft smile, the gentle warmth of her presence, and the sense that something had shifted irrevocably. We weren't just teacher and student anymore, we were two people cautiously exploring the edges of connection, slowly letting the world see pieces of who we truly were. And somewhere beneath the surface, I knew that the next time our hands brushed or our eyes met, it would feel just a little more electric, a little more charged, because we had shared something real. It was one of those rare afternoons when the campus seemed almost empty, the usual hum of students replaced by distant footsteps and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. I had just stepped into the classroom, still thinking about our previous conversation in her office, when she looked up from her desk and gave me that familiar, knowing smile, the one that made my chest tighten in ways I couldn't control. "Back so soon?" she asked lightly, her tone teasing but warm. "You really are lucky. I like smart mouths." Her words hit me in a way that was equal parts thrilling and unnerving. Lucky. Liked. The combination was subtle but powerful, a gentle acknowledgement that the tension between us was no longer just undercurrents, it was something we both recognized and, in a way, welcomed. I felt my pulse quicken, and for a moment, I wasn't entirely sure what to say. The easiest thing would have been to respond with something clever, something to match her playful challenge. But instead, I found myself smiling back, a little awkwardly, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the tension to settle comfortably around us. During the class discussion, our banter picked up again. Every time I answered a question or offered a comment, she responded with that subtle, playful sharpness that had always made my mind race. But now, there was something different in her tone, a warmth beneath the teasing, an unspoken acknowledgement that we were both aware of the silent connection that had been growing over weeks. At one point, she reached over to adjust a stack of papers near my notebook. Our hands brushed, light and fleeting, but it felt electric. The brief contact sent a shiver up my arm, and I noticed a small, amused glint in her eyes, as if she knew exactly the effect she had on me. I caught myself lingering a little longer than necessary in that glance, meeting her gaze, feeling the quiet pull that had been building between us. Even the little moments carried weight, the way she leaned slightly toward me while explaining a concept, the soft curl of her lips when she laughed at something I said, the tilt of her head that invited conversation without forcing it. Every gesture was deliberate yet casual, an intricate dance of subtle acknowledgement. By the end of the class, the room seemed smaller, the world quieter. We packed up slowly, lingering near each other as if neither of us wanted to break the spell. Her shoulder brushed mine lightly as she gathered her things, and I felt the warmth of that contact linger far longer than it should have. As I walked toward the door, she called softly, "See you later, smart mouth." Her voice was playful, yes, but beneath it lay something tender, a quiet acknowledgement of the connection we were both beginning to admit existed. I turned back and caught her gaze again, lingering a moment longer than necessary, and I realized that the tension, the subtle attraction, and the unspoken understanding between us had reached a turning point. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't bold, it was quiet, deliberate, and profoundly satisfying. For the first time, it felt like we were on the same page, each of us aware of the electric thread connecting us, each willing to explore it, gently, carefully, and entirely on our own terms. That playful acknowledgement was the spark that promised more, a bridge from tension to the emotional intimacy we had both been slowly building. The days that followed carried a quiet weight, a gentle anticipation that seemed to hum beneath the surface of every encounter. The playful glances, the subtle touches, and the soft, lingering smiles we shared in class had shifted something between us. The tension that had once been sharp and electric had softened into warmth, a steady undercurrent that I could feel whenever our eyes met. One afternoon, after class had ended and most of the students had trickled out, she called me over. The room was bathed in late afternoon sunlight, warm and golden, and the quiet hum of the campus outside made it feel as though the world had narrowed just to this space, to this moment between us. "Do you have a minute?" she asked, her tone casual, yet there was an unmistakable softness in her voice. I nodded, stepping closer, my heart beating a little faster than usual, aware that every detail, the tilt of her head, the curve of her lips, the warmth in her gaze, was significant, intentional or not. We talked, initially about classwork, but naturally drifting to more personal matters. She shared a small story from her past, something that revealed both humor and vulnerability, and I found myself laughing, genuinely engaged, but also struck by how much I cared about her reactions, her comfort, and the ease of her presence. In return, I shared a little about my own life, some frustrations, some hopes, moments of quiet insecurity. It wasn't dramatic or heavy, it was honest, warm, and human. Then, as we wrapped up, she reached out, resting her hand lightly on my shoulder. It was a simple gesture, fleeting, but the weight of it, the steady warmth, the quiet steadiness of her presence, settled over me in a way that made my chest feel full. Her fingers lingered for a heartbeat, and in that brief contact, I felt the culmination of weeks of subtle tension, playful teasing, and unspoken understanding. I looked at her, and she looked at me, and for a moment, words weren't necessary. The warmth in her eyes, the gentle curve of her smile, the calm steadiness of her posture, it all said what neither of us had yet voiced, that we had shared something real, delicate, and profoundly intimate. When she finally withdrew her hand, I felt a strange mix of relief and longing. Relief that the connection was acknowledged, longing for more moments like this, where presence and proximity, honesty, and subtle touch, could speak louder than anything else. As I walked out of the classroom, the late afternoon sunlight wrapping around the campus, I felt lighter, warmer, more grounded than I had in weeks. She waved gently from her desk, and I waved back, the gesture carrying an unspoken promise. This was not just fleeting, and it was not confined to the classroom. Over time, our relationship continued to unfold naturally. Each glance, each shared laugh, each fleeting brush of hands built on the foundation of mutual respect, understanding, and affection. There were no dramatic declarations, no overt gestures, just a steady, quiet closeness that made every interaction feel meaningful. The slow burn of our connection had reached its resolution, not in fireworks, but in warmth. In the steady, unspoken acknowledgement of each other's presence. In the quiet intimacy of trust, shared vulnerability, and the subtle thrill of being seen. And for the first time, I felt a deep certainty, this was more than attraction. This was a connection that could last, growing slowly, tenderly, and beautifully, just as it was always meant to.